The autumn that Eli Marsh turned 14, half the valley decided he'd lost his mind, and the other half just felt sorry for him. It started with a cart. Not even his own cart, a borrowed one, its wheels wobbling on a bent axle, pulled behind a mule that belonged to his neighbor and had clearly seen better decades. Eli would knock on doors up and down the valley, polite as anything, and ask the same strange question every single time. "Do you have any old plow frames you're not using?" "Broken ones, rusted ones. I'll take them off your hands." Now you have to understand what a plow frame meant to a frontier farmer in that stretch of land. It was iron, and iron was money, and money was scarce. But a broken plow frame, one with a snapped beam or a shattered share or a warped mold board, that wasn't worth anything to anybody. You couldn't plant with it. You couldn't sell it because nobody in 100 miles wanted junk when good tools were dear enough already. Most families just let their busted plow frames sit behind the barn, rusting into the weeds, half sunk in mud. Forgotten. It was the kind of thing you stepped over, not something you thought about. So when this skinny kid showed up asking to haul it away for free, most folks just shrugged and said, "Help yourself, boy," and good riddance. A few looked at him a little longer, like they were trying to figure out the trick. And a few, the ones with sharper tongues, didn't bother hiding what they thought. Old Man Hutchins was the loudest of them. He ran the biggest spread on the east side of the valley, 300 acres of good bottomland. And he had exactly the kind of voice that carried across a fence line whether you wanted to hear it or not. "Boy's gone soft in the head," he told anyone who'd listen, collecting junk like a crow collects shiny rocks. Somebody ought to tell his mother. Eli heard it. Of course he heard it. Hutchins wasn't exactly whispering, but he just nodded. Thanked the man for the 3 broken plow frames rusting behind his tool shed, loaded them onto the borrowed cart, and moved on to the next farm. That was the thing about Eli that people underestimated. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He just kept working. To understand why he was doing any of this, you have to go back a few months, to the spring, when his father died. Thomas Marsh had been a blacksmith, one of only 2 in the whole settlement, and the better one by most accounts. He wasn't a farmer, though he kept a small plot behind the house, same as everybody did, mostly for vegetables and a little corn. His real trade was iron, shoeing horses, mending wagon wheels, fixing the hinges and latches and tools that every homestead needed sooner or later. He'd built his forge himself when he first came out to the valley, dug the pit, laid the stone, rigged the bellows from an old set his own father had given him back east. And from the time Eli could walk, he'd been in that forge, first just watching, then holding things, then pumping the bellows, then, by the time he was 10, actually shaping metal himself under his father's eye. Thomas used to say the boy had an ear for iron, meaning he could tell by the sound of the hammer strike, by the particular ring of it, whether the metal was ready to bend or needed more heat. That's not something you can teach easily. Either you hear it or you don't. Eli heard it. Then, in March, a fever swept through the lower valley. The kind that came through every few years and took the old and the young and, sometimes, cruelly, the strong men in between. Thomas Marsh was 38 years old, and healthy as an ox, right up until the week he wasn't. He was gone in 9 days, and Eli's mother, Sarah, was left with a boy not yet grown, a smaller boy of 8 named Caleb, who wasn't Eli's blood but had been taken in 2 winters, back when his own parents didn't survive a bad flu season. The valley did that. Folks took in what family they could, and a forge that suddenly had no one qualified to run it, and a farm plot too small to feed 3 people through a hard winter. The other blacksmith in the settlement, a heavy-set man named Garrett Voss, offered to buy Thomas Marsh's tools and equipment for what Sarah later admitted was a fair enough price, maybe even a little generous. It would have solved a lot of problems fast. Sold the forge, banked the money, found some other way to get by. Eli asked his mother not to sell. Not yet. He didn't have some grand plan at that point. Not really. He just knew, in the stubborn way that 14-year-old boys sometimes know things without being able to explain them, that his father's forge was the one thing in the world he actually understood, and giving it up felt like giving up the last piece of the man himself. His mother, grieving and exhausted, and probably not in any state to argue hard about it, gave him until the first snow. If he could show her the forge was worth something, if he could bring in enough to matter, they'd keep it. If not, Voss's offer would still likely stand, and they'd take it and be grateful. That was the deal. Unspoken mostly, but understood between them the way important things sometimes are. So Eli had a forge, a boy's strength, a decent portion of his father's skill, absorbed over years of watching, and about 7 months before winter closed the valley in for good. What he didn't have was iron. That was the problem that kept him up at night that first month. A blacksmith without iron is just a man standing next to a cold fire. You could buy iron, shipped in from the trading post 2 days east, but it cost money they didn't have, and buying it in any quantity worth mentioning was completely out of reach, or wasn't dug locally. This wasn't that kind of country. Everything metal in the valley had been hauled in over the mountains at real expense, which was exactly why people held on to even broken tools rather than throw them out. Iron was precious. It just wasn't precious enough, apparently, to be worth fixing when it came to something as specific and oddly shaped as a shattered plow frame. That was Eli's opening, though it took him a few weeks of turning the problem over to see it clearly. A plow frame has a lot of iron in it: the share, the mold board, the beam fittings, the coulter, if it had one. When a plow broke, and they broke constantly, hitting rocks and roots in half-cleared frontier fields, sometimes it broke in a way you could repair, and farmers took it to Voss or, before, to Thomas Marsh, and paid to have it mended. But sometimes it broke in a way that wasn't worth repairing. The frame twisted, or the beam cracked clean through, in a spot that wouldn't hold the weld, or the whole thing had just worn down over years until it wasn't worth the labor of fixing versus the cost of a new one. Those frames didn't get repaired. They got dragged behind the barn and left to rust because hauling scrap iron 2 days east to sell it back to the trading post cost more in time and mule feed than the scrap was worth to anyone out here. Nobody wanted it. Nobody would pay for it. It was genuinely worthless to every single person who owned it. Except it wasn't worthless. Not to Eli, because Eli didn't need whole plows. He needed iron in any shape that he could melt down or reforge or cut apart and reshape into something else entirely. A broken plow frame was to everyone in the valley a piece of junk taking up space behind the tool shed. To a blacksmith's son, with a forge and time on his hands, it was raw material, just sitting there free for the taking. So he started asking. The first farm he tried was the Kellerman place, mostly because old Mrs. Kellerman had always been kind to his mother, bringing over bread the week after the funeral, that sort of thing. He explained what he wanted, a little awkwardly, standing in her yard with his hat in his hands the way his father used to when discussing serious business. She looked at him for a long moment, then laughed, not a mean laugh, more surprised than anything, and said, "Boy, if you want to haul that busted old thing out of my way, you're doing me a favor. Take it and welcome." That first frame, cracked clean through the beam, rusted orange-brown and half-tangled in blackberry bramble, went onto the back of the borrowed cart, and Eli pulled it home himself that day since he hadn't yet arranged for the mule. Word travels fast in a small settlement, and not always accurately. Within a week, the story going around wasn't, "The Marsh boy is collecting scrap iron for his forge." It was, "The Marsh boy is hauling junk around for reasons nobody can figure, probably because grief has addled him. People are generous with their pity and stingy with their curiosity." Nobody actually asked Eli what his plan was. They just watched him haul rusted iron across the valley, cartwheels squeaking, and shook their heads. Hutchins, as mentioned, was the least kind about it, but he wasn't alone. There was a particular kind of laughter that followed Eli that autumn, not cruel exactly, more the careless kind that comes from people who've decided they already understand a situation and don't need to look closer. Even his mother's friends would say things to her, gently, meaning well. "Is Eli quite all right, Sarah? Does he need something to occupy his time? Something more useful?" And Sarah, for her part, just said her boy was working and left it at that because honestly she wasn't entirely sure herself what he was building toward. She'd made her deal, she was going to hold to it. Caleb, the younger boy, was the only one who asked outright what all the iron was for. He was 8, and 8-year-olds don't yet know that they're supposed to have already decided what's silly and what isn't. He just wanted to know. Eli told him the truth, as much of it as he had at that point, which wasn't the whole plan, because the whole plan hadn't fully formed yet. He said, "I'm going to build something the valley needs and doesn't have." That's all he had, but he said it with enough certainty that Caleb believed him completely and started tagging along on the cart trips, which turned out to be useful, because a second set of hands loading rusted iron onto a wagon bed is worth having, even small hands. By the end of September, Eli had made the rounds of nearly every farm within a half-day's travel. He'd gathered, all told, pieces from 11 different broken plows. Some just fragments, a share here, a bent coulter there, but several nearly whole frames, twisted but largely intact. He'd also picked up, almost as an afterthought, a broken wagon axle from the Petersons, 2 ruined hinges from the church that nobody had bothered to fix, and a stack of horseshoe fragments that Garrett Voss himself had tossed in his scrap pile behind his own smithy, waving Eli off with a bemused sort of shrug when the boy asked. Voss, to his credit, wasn't unkind about it. He was the established smith now, the only working one in the valley, and he had no reason to see Eli as a threat, especially since the boy was clearly just gathering junk for reasons Voss assumed were sentimental. Maybe the kid wanted to keep his hand in the trade his father taught him, tinker a little, nothing serious. "Take whatever you want from the pile, son," he told Eli. "Won't be using it." That scrap pile, as it turned out, was more valuable to Eli than Voss ever imagined. Now, here's where I should tell you what Eli was actually planning, because by this point even I've kept you waiting long enough. Every fall, without fail, the valley faced the same brutal problem, and every fall, without fail, people lost money, animals, and sometimes worse, dealing with it. Winter in that country came in hard and came in fast, and once the snow set in, which it usually did by late November, travel between farms became genuinely dangerous. Not just difficult, dangerous trails vanished under drifts. Wagon wheels sank and froze in place. More than one settler over the years had died trying to make it from an outlying farm to the settlement center during a bad storm, seeking help for a sick child or a birthing that had gone wrong, or simply supplies that had run out too early. The other thing that happened every winter, with grim regularity, was that families ran short, not everyone, but enough. A bad harvest, an illness that kept a farmer from bringing in the full crop, a fire that took a grain store, any number of things could leave a family scraping by come January and February, the leanest months, when the previous year's stores were dwindling and the new planting was still months off. In good years, the valley had an informal system where families who had extra would share with families who didn't, but there was no reliable way to move supplies once the snow really set in. You couldn't always get a wagon through. Sled dogs weren't common that far into the frontier, and horses struggled in deep drift snow, sinking and tiring fast, sometimes breaking a leg in a hidden gully, hidden under the white. Thomas Marsh had talked about this problem more than once, actually sitting by the forge in the evenings thinking aloud the way he sometimes did while Eli listened. He'd seen a design once, back east, before he ever came out to the frontier. A sled runner assembly that could be fitted under a small cart or wagon bed, allowing it to glide over snow instead of getting bogged down in it. He'd never built one himself, never had the reason to or the excess iron to spare for a project that wasn't paying work, but he described it to Eli in enough detail, more than once, clearly turning the idea over in his own mind as something he might tackle someday, that the shape of it had lodged itself firmly in the boy's memory. That was what Eli was building toward. Not a plow. Not a repaired tool to sell back to a farmer. A sled. Or, more specifically, a set of iron-shod sled runners sturdy enough to bear real weight that could be fitted beneath a simple wooden frame to create a supply sled, something that could carry food, medicine, firewood, whatever a family needed, across deep snow where a wheeled cart would be helpless and a horse alone might founder. And he wasn't planning to build just one. This is the part that Eli hadn't told anybody. Not his mother, Not Caleb, not a soul in the valley, because he knew exactly how it would sound if he said it out loud before he had anything to show for it. He wasn't collecting iron to build himself a nice sled for his own family's use, though that would come too. Eventually, he was collecting enough iron, piece by piece, farm by farm, broken frame by broken frame, to build several. Enough that when winter came and the valley inevitably faced its usual crisis, some family cut off, some farm in need, some emergency requiring goods to move across country that no wheeled cart could cross, there would be something available that had never existed in that valley before. He was 14 years old, grieving his father, trying to save his family's livelihood, and he decided, apparently without asking anyone's permission, to solve a problem that had plagued the entire valley for as long as anyone could remember. It sounds almost too large a thing for a boy that age to take on. And in fairness, if you'd asked Eli directly whether that's what he was doing, he might not have described it in such grand terms. He probably would have just said, "My pa always said somebody should build one of these, and I've got the iron, and I've got the forge, and I've got the time before the snow comes." That was as far as his thinking went, most days. The rest of it, the scope of what it might mean for the valley, that came later, almost as a surprise to him as it was to everyone else. October came in with a bite of cold that told everyone winter was going to arrive early that year, which only added urgency to what Eli was doing. He'd spend his mornings on the last few farms he hadn't yet visited, then afternoons and long stretches of evening at the forge, the fire built up, hammer ringing. This is where the real work started, and where the town's laughter, if anything, got a little louder, because now Eli wasn't just hauling junk, TAS. And he was clearly doing something with it, and what he was doing looked, to anyone glancing in through the open front of the smithy, like absolute nonsense. He wasn't repairing the plow frames, anyone could see that. He was cutting them apart, heating sections of the twisted iron until they glowed, and then working them with hammer and anvil into shapes that didn't look like any plow anyone had ever seen. Long curved runners with an upturned lip at the front, flat iron shoes meant to sit beneath a wooden frame and take the wear of ice and snow and rough ground. It was slow work, made slower by the fact that a 14-year-old boy, however skilled for his age, was working largely alone, without the second pair of hands a smithy really needs, for a lot of tasks, someone to hold and turn stock while another swings the hammer, someone to work the bellows steadily while the smith concentrates on the shaping. Caleb helped where he could. He was small, but he could pump bellows for stretches, and he learned quickly to fetch and hold and stay out of the way of sparks, and, honestly, having another set of eyes and hands around probably saved Eli a fair number of burns and mistakes that a solitary boy working exhausted evening hours might otherwise have made. Sarah Marsh watched all this with an expression that people in the settlement found hard to read. She wasn't laughing along with the others, not even a little, but she also wasn't defending Eli loudly to anyone who mocked him. Mostly, she just let him work and made sure there was food on the table when he finally came in from the forge each night, hands blackened, shoulders aching, in a way that a boy his age shouldn't have to feel yet. Once, late in October, her sister came to visit from a farm on the far side of the valley, and over supper gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept Garrett Voss's offer for the forge equipment that watching Eli work himself to exhaustion over would look like nothing was hard to bear. That perhaps it would be kinder to just end it now rather than let him fail slowly and publicly once the whole valley had had their laugh. Sarah didn't respond to that directly. She just said, "We agreed on first snow." And that was that. By early November, Eli had completed the first full runner set, 2 long iron-shod wooden runners, ironwork forged mostly from the frames off the Hutchins farm and the Kellerman place, along with the cross braces salvaged from Peterson's broken axle. He built a simple flatbed frame to sit atop them, wide enough to hold several sacks of grain or a stack of firewood, or, if it came to it, a person lying down wrapped in blankets being hauled to help. He tested it first on the low slope behind his family's house, before any real snow had come, just dragging it empty over frost-hardened dirt and dead grass to check that the runners held true and didn't bind or twist under weight. Then he loaded it with stones to test it under load. Then he waited impatiently for enough snow to actually try it the way it was meant to be tried. The first real snowfall came on the 11th of November, an early dumping of nearly a foot overnight that had most of the valley grumbling about an early hard winter and hurriedly finishing last preparations. Eli was out at first light, before most of the settlement had even dug their way to their own front doors, testing his sled on the fresh snow with Caleb riding on top for ballast. And, frankly, for the sheer joy of it, an 8-year-old whooping down a slope on a device his brother had built out of what everyone said was worthless junk. It worked. Better than work. The runners cut smoothly through the fresh powder, gliding rather than dragging, and even loaded with the weight of a boy and a sack of stones besides. It moved with a fraction of the effort that a wheeled cart would have needed just to get unstuck from the same snow. Eli pulled it himself by a rope harness he'd rigged, and found he could move loads across snow-covered ground that would have completely stopped a horse and wagon. A few neighbors saw this early test, since sound carries in a snow-quiet morning, and Caleb's laughing wasn't exactly subtle. Word went around the settlement by midday. The Marsh boys built some kind of sled, people said, and there was still plenty of amusement in how they said it, because a sled, in itself, wasn't exactly some miracle of engineering. Plenty of folks had rough sleds for hauling wood short distances. What was so special about a boy's sled? What people didn't understand yet, because they hadn't seen it in action under real conditions, was the runner design itself. Most rough farm sleds in the valley, the few that existed, were built entirely of wood, sometimes with a thin strip of iron or even just a scorched and hardened wood edge along the bottom of the runner to reduce friction and wear. Wood on snow worked all right for light loads over short, flat distances, but it wore down fast on rough or icy ground. It dragged heavily in deeper or wetter snow, and it couldn't handle real weight without the runners themselves starting to crack or splay under the load. What Eli had built, using his father's half-remembered description and his own trial and error over those October weeks, had full iron shoes along the entire runner length, not just a strip but a proper-shaped iron surface, curved up at the front in a way that let it ride up and over obstructions instead of plowing into them, and a wider stance than the informal sleds people occasionally cobbled together, which gave it stability under heavier, less evenly distributed loads. The iron itself, being scavenged from plow frames that had been designed originally to cut through soil and rock, was thicker and tougher than anything a farmer would normally have bothered dedicating to a simple wood-hauling sled. It was, in effect, seriously overbuilt for casual use, in exactly the way that made it perfect for hauling real weight across real distances in real winter conditions. Eli didn't stop at one. That had never been the plan. Through the rest of November, even as the snow deepened and the days shortened and the work got colder and harder, he kept at the forge, using the remaining scavenged iron to build 2 more runner sets, each slightly refined from the last, as he learned what worked and adjusted the curve of the front lip, the spacing of the cross braces, the depth of the runner itself. By the time the valley had its first real hard freeze in early December, Eli had 3 complete iron-runnered sleds sitting behind his family's house, plus enough scrap left over, mostly smaller fragments, to consider a 4th if things went well. And then, as these things tend to happen, the valley handed him the exact proof he needed, whether he wanted it that way or not. The Ferris family lived on the far northwestern edge of the settlement's reach, nearly 6 miles out on a stretch of land that was good for grazing, but isolated enough that in a bad winter they were effectively cut off from everyone else for weeks at a stretch. There were 4 of them: Daniel Ferris, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, a girl of 6 and a boy of 4. It was a hard little homestead, always scraping by, and that particular year had been worse than most because Daniel had broken his arm badly back in September, falling from a hayloft, and hadn't been able to work at full strength through the harvest. Their stores going into winter were thinner than they should have been. In the second week of December, with nearly 2 feet of snow already on the ground and drifts considerably deeper in places, word reached the settlement, carried by a neighboring farmer who'd made the trip on horseback, exhausting his animal badly in the process, that little Ferris girl had taken seriously ill. High fever, trouble breathing. The kind of sickness that could turn fatal fast in small children, especially out in an isolated homestead, without easy access to whatever passed for medicine and care in a settlement that far out on the frontier. The settlement did have a woman, Widow Okafor, who trained as a nurse before coming west, and who served as the closest thing to a doctor most families ever saw. She had supplies, herbs, a bit of real medical knowledge. But she was 61 years old, and 6 miles through 2 feet of snow with worsening drifts was simply not a journey she could make on foot or, safely, on horseback, in the failing light of a December afternoon with more snow threatening. This was exactly the kind of situation that in an ordinary year ended one of 2 ways. Either someone made a dangerous, sometimes fatal attempt to get through anyway, driven by desperation, or nobody made it in time, and the family was left to manage alone with whatever they had on hand, hoping for the best. Eli heard about it within an hour of the news reaching the settlement, because news like that moves fast, and his own house wasn't far from the little cluster of buildings at the settlement's center. He didn't deliberate long. He hitched himself into the harness of his best sled, the third and most refined of the 3 he'd built, loaded it with blankets and firewood he grabbed from his own woodpile, and went to find Widow Okafor. The offer he made her was simple. He couldn't guarantee anything, he told her, but he built something that might get her there faster and safer than trying to push a horse through drift snow, and he was willing to pull it himself the whole 6 miles, if she was willing to ride and guide him on the route, since she knew the Ferris homestead and the fastest way there better than he did. Widow Okafor, by all later accounts, looked at this 14-year-old boy and his strange iron-shod sled with open skepticism. But she also understood, better than most, exactly how dire the alternative looked, and she was not a woman inclined to let pride or doubt get in the way of a sick child's chances. She bundled herself in every warm layer she owned, packed her medical bag securely onto the sled bed alongside the blankets and firewood, and told Eli to get moving. What followed became, within days, the single most talked about event in the valley that entire winter and arguably for several winters after. The trip should have been brutal. 6 miles through knee-deep and in places waist-deep drift snow. In failing afternoon light, temperatures already well below freezing and dropping further as the sun sank. A horse, even a strong one, would have struggled badly, likely needing to stop repeatedly, possibly injuring itself in hidden dips and gullies masked by the snow cover. A person on foot alone would have taken most of the night, arriving exhausted, hypothermic, possibly too late to be of any use at all. Eli, pulling the sled with Widow Okafor riding and calling out directions, made the trip in just over 2 hours. The iron runners did exactly what they were built to do. They didn't sink the way a wheel would, didn't drag the way an unshod wooden sled would have in that depth of snow. The wide stance kept the loads stable even crossing slanted ground, and the occasional hidden obstruction. Ellie, young and strong from months of forge work and farm labor, found the pulling hard but sustainable, nothing like the punishing slog it would have been trying to wade that distance on foot or force a horse through it. They arrived at the Ferris homestead a little after full dark, both of them frozen through and exhausted, but arrived with more than enough daylight's worth of time still ahead of the crisis to matter. Widow Okafor got to work immediately. The girl had a severe fever and a chest congestion that, left untreated through the night, likely would have worsened dangerously by morning. With proper care, herbs, and the kind of careful nursing only someone with real training could provide, the fever broke by early the next day, and the girl, though weak for a week or more afterward, recovered completely. Daniel and Margaret Ferris would say, for years afterward, to anyone who'd listen, that their daughter was alive because of that boy and his strange iron sled, and they were not people prone to exaggeration. Eli and Widow Okafor stayed the night at the Ferris homestead, since making the return trip in full dark with an exhausted boy and an elderly woman wasn't sensible, and headed back to the settlement the following morning, the sled now carrying, at Margaret Ferris's insistence, a sack of preserved goods and a cured ham as thanks, since the family didn't have money to spare but wasn't about to let the debt go entirely unacknowledged. By the time they reached the settlement again, the story had already started spreading on its own. carried by the neighboring farmer who'd first brought word of the illness and who'd apparently been keeping half an ear out for news all night, anxious himself about how it had gone. The reaction in the valley was not instant sweeping vindication, because that's not really how these things work in real life. People don't usually announce, all at once, that they were wrong about something. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more meaningful. People started asking questions instead of making jokes. They started actually looking at the sled, at the ironwork, at the design, instead of glancing past it toward whatever assumption they'd already made. Garrett Voss, the established smith, was among the first to come by and take a proper look, and to his credit, he didn't pretend otherwise or downplay what he saw. He crouched by the runner assembly for a long while, running his thick fingers along the iron shoe, testing the weld points, studying how the cross braces distributed weight across the wooden frame. He asked Eli detailed questions. Where'd you learn this curve at the front? Why this thickness of iron here versus there? How'd you manage the bend without cracking stock this old and brittle from years of rust? Eli answered every question plainly, the way his father had taught him to talk about the work. Not boastfully, just factually. This is why I did this. This is what I was trying to solve. Voss straightened up eventually, looked the boy over for a moment, and said, "Your father would be proud of this." Then he added, more practically, "You're going to need more iron than a season's worth of scrap plow frames if people start wanting these built proper." That was, in its way, the moment the tide really turned, because if Garrett, Voss, established, respected, a grown man with 30 years in the trade, was willing to say publicly that the boy had built something worth taking seriously, that carried weight in a way that a sick child's recovery, however moving, hadn't quite managed on its own. People trust craftsmanship being vouched for by another craftsman. Old Man Hutchins, notably, did not come by to look at the sled himself, at least not right away, and didn't offer any public retraction of his earlier comments about boys gone soft in the head collecting junk. Pride is a stubborn thing, and Hutchins had more of it than most. But here's what did happen. About 2 weeks later, in mid-December, when a hard cold snap combined with fresh heavy snowfall to leave several outlying farms, including, as it happened, Hutchins's own eastern grazing plots, cut off from easy travel to the settlement center for supply runs. Hutchins sent his hired hand, a quiet young man named Powell, to the Marsh place, not Hutchins himself, to ask, somewhat awkwardly, whether the boy might be willing to build him one of those iron sleds for a fair price. Obviously, whatever seemed reasonable. Eli, to his credit, and probably with some quiet satisfaction, he was too polite to show openly, said yes, he'd be glad to, though it would take some time since his iron stock was limited and he wanted to do the work properly rather than rush it. That was the beginning of what became, over that winter and into the following year, a genuinely new trade for the Marsh household. Eli didn't stop scavenging broken plow frames. If anything, farmers started bringing them to him now instead of leaving them to rust behind their sheds, since word had spread that the Marsh boy paid a little something for scrap iron, or would trade labor for it, or would simply take it and, in exchange, move you up the list when it came time to build the next sled. What had been worthless junk cluttering every farmyard in the valley had, almost overnight, become a resource people were suddenly eager to hand over rather than let sit. By the time real winter set in fully, with the valley locked under snow for the season, there were in total 5 of Eli's sleds in operation, his family's original 3, Hutchins's newly commissioned one, and a 5th built for the settlement itself, kept at the center of town under a loose community arrangement where it could be borrowed by whoever had the most urgent need, whether that meant hauling emergency supplies, fetching Widow Okafor for another sick call, or simply moving firewood and grain between farms that the season had otherwise cut off from each other. The nickname started sometime around the new year, and nobody's entirely sure who coined it first, though several people later claimed credit. People started calling them Marsh sleds, plainly enough, and the name stuck hard enough that even years later, long after other smiths and other settlements had copied and adapted the design for their own valleys, folks in that particular stretch or frontier still called any iron-runnered snow sled a Marsh sled, regardless of who'd actually built it. Sarah Marsh never did sell the forge to Garrett Voss. That conversation simply stopped happening, faded away without anyone needing to formally close it out, because by the time the first snow had actually fallen and the deadline she'd set had technically arrived, there was no question left to settle. Her son had a trade, a growing reputation, and, more importantly, to her in that first hard winter of widowhood, a purpose that was pulling him through his grief in a way that sitting idle never would have. Caleb, for his part, became something like Eli's first real apprentice, not just a bellows boy anymore, but someone actually learning the trade properly, the way Eli himself had learned it from their father, standing at the anvil, listening for that particular ring in the iron that told you when it was ready. There's a version of this story that would end with the whole valley gathering together for some grand celebration, everyone admitting how wrong they'd been, Hutchins delivering some heartfelt apology in front of the whole settlement. That's not really what happened, because real life rarely wraps up quite so neatly. What happened instead was smaller and honestly probably more true to how these things actually go. People just quietly stopped laughing. They started nodding to Eli on the road, instead of whispering behind him. They started sending their sons over to the forge sometimes, not to mock, but to watch, the way Eli himself had once watched his father. Curious about a trade that had proven itself useful in the way that mattered most out on a hard frontier, by saving something worth saving when it counted, in weather that gave you exactly one chance to get it right. Winters in that valley kept coming the way they always had, hard and long and dangerous in all the old familiar ways. But from that year forward, there was a little less of that particular fear that used to settle over outlying farms every December, the fear of being cut off, of needing help that couldn't reach you in time, of watching the snow pile up outside the window, and wondering if this would be the year it finally won. Because now, scattered across the valley, there were these strange, sturdy, iron-runnered sleds, built out of what everybody had once considered the most worthless scrap imaginable, gliding easily over the exact conditions that used to trap everyone in place. And every single one of them, if you looked closely enough at the metal, if you knew what you were looking at, still carried the ghost of some farmer's broken plow, forged over by a grieving boy who'd seen value where everyone else saw junk, in a season when the whole valley had laughed at him and he'd simply kept working anyway, because he'd understood something the rest of them hadn't yet figured out. Sometimes the thing everybody's thrown away is exactly the thing somebody else needs to build the future with. You just have to be willing to go door to door and ask for it, and be patient enough and stubborn enough to see the shape of what it could become long before anyone else can see it too. That's the story of the Marsh sleds and the winter. A valley learned not to laugh quite so quickly at a boy hauling junk on a borrowed cart.